This week on the show, I try to bring you the perspective of oil industry workers who are facing the transition. They explain to me what a pension is.
Michelin is starting a pilot project to test airless automobile tires with the French Postal Service. I rate this project 3 Michelin stars.
Batteries, that's right. Batteries supplied over 25% of the California grid Sunday evening. More than hydro, more than gas, more than coal, more than wind, more than nuclear, more than Tom Cruise's smile.
Disneyland has announced that their Autopia ride at the park will switch to electric vehicles by, let me check this, late 2026. That must be a typo. Surely they mean 1956. Walt Disney's frozen head is rolling in its grave. Or not. He probably loved exhaust fumes.
All that and more on this edition of The Clean Energy Show. We have lots more on the show this week, Brian, and including Saturday night, I went to a book launch for the Unjust Transition, the Future of Fossil Fuel Workers. It was standing room only at a pub, and it was a very unique experience. I remember one time, in support of a friend with alcoholism, I went to an AA meeting. And I felt like I was in a movie, you know? It was one of those experiences where I've seen some union movies in my time. It felt different to me. And let's face it, I don't get out much. You know that?
No.
Not recently.
You didn't get sick, which is great.
Well, so far, we'll see.
So it sounds like a scene from Norma Ray or something.
Something like that, yeah. Yeah, there was, it was something. The book covers a 6-month labor lockout that concluded in 2020. It actually went into when the pandemic started and the launch of our podcast, one of the other significant things that happened at that point in time. Here's just a clip of one of the union leaders that spoke at this event. And I just want to put it on here to give you just a little taste of the atmosphere and what they're talking about.
They tried everything to divide the public by putting billboards up that were outright lies. And now we see that same thing happening by our frickin' government. Yeah. They made personal attacks on me to try and make me the villain, but they didn't realize that I was locked out right with my colleagues.
I've come to realize, Brian, that oil workers cope with cognitive dissonance because I got this sense from listening to them, from reading their interviews, from my relatives. There's this tone in their voice and the way they talk about the transition and climate change that, well, I guess people think we should transition. I guess there's a problem. Just the way they talk about it, it seems like they're coping. And I don't blame them for coping. I don't hold that against them. I mean, if you work in tobacco, you're not going to think, well, my product's going to cause somebody cancer. But that's the situation they're in, and I've just come to realize that a bit more and understand it a bit more. I have a better understanding of the importance of their jobs to them because they're not any jobs. You know, these are people with little education who are making $130,000 a year and have a very solid pension, which is what they're fighting to keep, because the refinery that's located in our city here in Canada used the transition to say, hey, we got to take away your pensions, or we got to change your pensions, we got to alter them because, you know, we're not going to have a future, so we got to change that in order to survive. We got to use some money to adapt to this whole climate change things that everyone seems to be talking about. But meanwhile, they're providing something we all need. They have a job that they take pride in. You know, your neighbors go to the drive to work. You help with that. You help get them on a plane.
The world still runs on oil.
And just talking to people in general, you know, my friend said, we're in every lefty in Regina's here. It felt, actually, Oppenheimer would have provided the most recent example because they were going to Communist Party meetings in the 30s. This wasn't communist, obviously, but it was a little left and a little political. And, you know, the fossil fuel workers, I don't think are inherently left. They are fighting for union rights and worker rights, but they live and work and are friends among people who are, you know, convoy protesters. But they also say that those convoy protesters and that ilk of people who are angry at the world right now, they say they support oil and gas, but they're not supporting the workers, they're supporting the companies. I mean, ultimately, when you say you support oil and gas, it's because your friends and neighbors work in oil and gas in this province, which is a petro province, Saskatchewan. So, yeah, but also just talking to people, I realize that no one knows anything. Even these lefties, they don't know a damn thing about what you and I talk about every week. But of course, I plug the podcast, and some of them are going to listen. But I also had a different perspective for the podcast where I feel like we have a turnover of people, new people come into the show a lot. Our audience grows like any podcast. I feel like I shy away from simple explanations because I've explained something before. And I feel now like I should constantly dumb things down for a newbie, if you will, like constantly try and explain things. And I know I ask for the patience of our longtime listeners to put up with that, but I think it's important that we not exclude people by getting too far into the weeds about what we talk about and maybe giving some perspective and reminding people every time we, discuss things. I'm going to talk about batteries on the grid, and that's a very, very different thing. How's the sale of your car going? You're selling your Model 3, the first electric car you bought 4 years ago now.
Yeah, I plugged it on the show last week. I was taking it down to Rev Auto, but it basically sold before our podcast even came out. So
are you kidding?
I told people.
That's why it's not on the site.
Yeah, I told people on the episode last week, hey, somebody go buy my car. But yeah, before it came out, they were talking to somebody, which took a day or two to sort of finalize the sale, but sold super quick.
Oh, well, that's good because, one of the headaches of selling a house or a car is like having to wait and then maybe bring your price down and you're hemming and hawing. Sounds like a pretty painless experience. It was sold at a place that specializes in electric cars, although they take trade-ins and sell those too that are gas cars, and they take a commission off of it. It's a consignment place. So I had a pretty good experience there. Better than selling it myself and a lot better than selling it to a dealership or trading it in, including Tesla.
No, I had a great experience because, we are still in oil country. So in terms of electric vehicle penetration, we're falling way behind. So there aren't a lot of places, car dealerships where you can go and feel comfortable if you're looking to buy an electric car. We've talked many times on the show about people go down to dealers, they go down to GM and it's like, oh, we don't have a EV on the floor right now. Why don't you buy this diesel truck or whatever? But they want to specialize in electric vehicles. So they're the early adopters. They're the frontier. Eventually everyone else will come around. But
plus I can see them saying, no one wants an electric car. We're going to have to give you, just a couple bucks for it. I can see them saying that.
Yeah, it's that's the only way I think I would sell a car from now on. Doing it privately is always such a pain in the ass, and they were great.
Yeah, and I think it was you who just set me up with that because you said you'd heard about a consignment place, so I Googled it and found them, and I'm really glad I did because I didn't want to sell it privately. That would have been a pain in the butt.
Yeah, and they sell electric bikes there as well. They're the Bike Tricks dealer, the electric bike maker from Saskatoon, and they're the local dealer for those, so you can pick up an electric bike there as well. Awesome place.
So, Brian, you and I guess now own 4 electric cars between us. It was 5 for a short time because you upgraded your to a Tesla Model Y, and you also have a Tesla Model S, the more expensive, bigger of the cars. I've got a 6-year-old car to me that's now 11 years old, the early Nissan Leaf. I'm using it just for around town here, and we bought a Chevy Bolt for my wife and for highway trips. So we have those 2 electric cars. Of course, we love them, and you and I talk about this all the time and the advantages. We also talk about how it gets down to minus 40 here. Much colder than most of the populated places of Norway and Alaska, and those places were the real testing grounds for electric cars. We love them. And I was watching TV the other day, as I sometimes do, and the news was on. And there was a national news report from CBC on rising gas prices in Montreal about how everyone was affected, how everyone wasn't happy about this. And while I'm watching this reporter stand up on the street, 2, not 1, but 2 Chevy Bolts go by. Fully electric cars that are actually pretty rare, relatively speaking, compared to Teslas. If 2 Teslas went by, I would have said, oh, that's interesting. I'm not shocked. It's a bit of a coincidence and kind of ironic, but this was, It just, you and I don't care about rising gas prices. It does not affect us. I have not looked at a gas station price in a long time, except if I'm curious to see what other people are doing. But electricity stays the same rate, more or less. I mean, it inches up, but we also have solar panels on our roof. By the way, this podcast, sunny day here in the prairies of Canada, fully solar powered. And then some. Powered. Not only are we solar powered, we're sending solar to the grid so our neighbors can be solar powered too. If my neighbor has a podcast, and I hope they don't, because, 2.5 million is enough competition for me. I don't need them having a podcast as well.
I'm making about 5,000 watts right now off my solar system. Easily can power the podcast with some extra.
And I'm approaching 3, which is my maximum. It starts to approach that around this time of midday. So I was curious about, there was some big news out of California that I'll get to in a second about batteries on the grid, and I mentioned at the top of the show. We were supposed to have some here in our city. Now, we live in a backwards province here. We're not doing much. We're not doing much with solar or wind or anything. We have a little bit of wind. But these batteries, they've put them onto the grid to try them out. Now, meanwhile, California has a fair bit of them, and they're just getting started. But these are practically test batteries. So I went and had a look. I drove out there on Saturday and actually took the time to go have a look. This is I guess a substation in northeast Regina, not that far from the refinery. It actually feeds, you can watch the wires go all the way to the transmission lines, go to the refinery. And they're also building a solar farm in the general area, but it's 2 years behind, and no one has talked about that. We don't have journalists around here to actually hold the government accountable. But that solar farm, they have not turned over an inch of soil. Nothing has happened yet. So, but these batteries, they look like containers that would go onto the back of trucks. Some of them are bigger than these, but these are more shorter containers, but they are containers nonetheless, and they contain lithium-ion batteries. And they power the grid. So I looked up, you could look up the brand name of the battery and the company that makes them, and I noticed they have a minus 45 degree option. So you could option them for minus 45. I'm assuming they've done that, because if you don't do that, they're only operational to minus 20. So you want them to be operational. We don't often have cold snaps, but there's quite a few days where it will probably go below minus 20 in the wintertime, so you want them to be operational. The cool things about these batteries, even small ones like this, small number of them, is that they respond in something like 125 milliseconds. So they're instant response. If you have something trip offline on a power grid, say, a generating plant of some sort, you got to fire up the turbines and get them going. And then meanwhile, the grid collapses and goes down, you lose equipment, and the power company has to spend, thousands and thousands of dollars repairing different equipment and man hours and all that. But like I said, California, this is a big thing for me, Brian. We've been doing this podcast for 4 years, and a switch went off in my head. We've been told the batteries can fill in, but it is even for us a hard concept to grasp. And I know I'm told, I don't read the comments on Twitter, but I'm told when I posted this, people were laughing at it. The oil people were laughing. Well, it's a fact. I mean, you can't laugh at it if it's a fact. This is what the grid operator data put out.
Yeah, I think you're right. They're just not used to the idea that, well, it's like, surely you need some gigantic plant to power your grid. Just the concept that you can power your grid with batteries probably just seems weird to people. But, guess what? You have a lot of them. It totally powers the grid and does a better job usually than other forms of grid power because, like you say, it has a kind of an instant response. So you have far fewer, blackouts and brownouts.
They have, they call it stabilizing the grid. So, and sometimes they have what they call virtual power plants, which is a whole bunch of little batteries. Sometimes they could be cars, although that's not happening yet. It can happen, electric cars going backwards into the grid. But some people have batteries in their homes for power backup and to store some of their solar power for economic reasons. It doesn't make a whole lot of economic sense most places in the world, but there are places where it does. And then they create or people just want to, and people like you who just say, damn it, I'm going to spend the money and and get off fossil fuels. So they can create these virtual power plants where the power company controls them. And then you can say, well, I'll let my battery go down to 50%, and then, the grid uses that, and then they pay you for it because that power is particularly valuable to them, so they actually pay you well for it. Some people in the summer, I think in California or Texas, yeah, they got like $1,000 for doing this. Because the grid, they wouldn't even notice it, Brian. They wouldn't even notice their batteries going down or anything different. But the check comes in the mail and says, we used your battery, 10% here and 5% there, and we needed it, and it worked.
Yeah, and it can often be cheaper for the utility to do that, like just pool a bunch of people's home batteries. And there are lots of home batteries around the world. It's cheaper for them to pool those home batteries than to build a whole nother power utility or to build a whole nother battery station.
But California, of course, is going big on clean energy. And as such, they've used a lot of batteries, but really they've only got started. I mean, this isn't an advanced battery deployment we're at yet. We've read about, a few places here and there that have developed, little battery generating stations or backup power stations. So what they do is they use the solar, and then when the sun goes down, they take that solar and put it into the grid while the demand is still high, because the power demand is high in the late afternoon and early evenings when people come home from work and they turn on their ovens and lights and computers, and then they eventually slow down their electricity use watching Matlock and go to bed. And that's the way it works. So what the batteries do is they provide power. So at 8 o'clock, I think this was last Tuesday, but it was also Sunday night. They did even better. They did 1% better. They broke 25% on Sunday night. This is the 5th largest economy in the world. The number one power source came from lithium-ion batteries, large batteries. A bunch of modules in containers that are mounted on concrete pads that get fed into the grid. But the number one source was batteries. And that, Brian, threw a switch in my head that said, hey, this is possible. This is what the future is going to look like. Why? Because nothing is the same now. Batteries are going down in price. We saw last week that there's going to be a glut of them, a glut of manufacturing, so the prices are going to just tank. It's not going to be good for the battery manufacturers. It is going to be good for the energy transition. And if anyone's saying, hey, what about the batteries and the minerals? We had stories before, and we'll have them again. We'll remind you that the minerals and batteries today will be in use 130 years from now, one study says. And one study also said that, because they get better, they're always getting better, that those minerals will be almost indefinite. We don't know what power supply we're going to be using 130 years from now. Maybe it's fusion. Maybe it's, who knows? But they're going to be around.
And there is a lot of mining associated with batteries because you do need these minerals, but it's a drop in the bucket compared to the mining we do every single day to dig up oil and then use it once by burning it. So this is absolutely stuff that can be recycled. So the mining eventually will tail off. We won't need as much as we need now, but this is a great future.
So if you think about one of those big containers on the back of a truck full of batteries that become, mounted somewhere near a power station and feed the grid, whatever you pay for that, it lasts, I think, around 8 years now, maybe 10 years before they replace them. Batteries, the more you use them, the more they're not completely wasted, but they're only like 60% of their output. So you pay for all the output that you expect to get out of that, and that's a cost per unit. We call them kilowatt hours at 1,000 watts for an hour. But if you think about that, there's new batteries coming from China that are going to last 15 years guaranteed. So you double the amount of time for the same battery. That means essentially whatever you pay for it, it's now half the cost because it's lasting twice as long. And, whatever we have now, it's going to be so much different as those costs fall. They last longer and they store more. The same battery stores more, so you need less equipment for that battery, to process it and turn it into AC power from DC power and things like that. And it's just, I'm sold. The batteries we can have 100% clean grid with batteries filling that gap. The question is, I know the UK, they're talking about 3 days of storage, of battery storage for what they call the dark times in winter, the worst case scenario. And then you also factor in transmission lines to share that energy because it's never never cloudy everywhere. It's never not windy everywhere. So you share that back and forth geographically. And, places like the UK can get their electricity all the way from Africa. They're working on that. They're putting cables under the ocean to take solar and wind from Morocco and places like that. So, yeah, I'm really sold, Brian.
I picked up a friend a couple of weeks ago in my electric car, and we just, went for coffee somewhere, and we're just chatting over coffee. And she says to me, "Oh, I heard about some amazing breakthrough that's going to make electric cars totally, viable and the thing of the future." And I looked her in the eye and I said, "I drove you here in an electric car.
Oh my God.
And so, yeah, the technology is already.
What was the response to that?
She laughed. She realized what she had done.
Yeah.
But of course, the price still has to come down. But the idea is the technology, everything we have is good enough now for cars, for grid storage, for home storage, and it's only going to get better and cheaper from here. But if we had to go forward with the technology we have now, it would absolutely work.
So this was Sunday night in California. Again, the fifth largest economy in the world. We're not talking United States. We're talking California is the fifth largest economy. It is more than Canada. I mean, it's more than a lot of countries. So batteries were at 25.4% of the grid. Next was hydro at 21.4%, and then natural gas at 19.2%. The imported some. 15.9. Some of it was imported because there was excess renewables other places. Wind was 7.1%, and nuclear, this base load that everybody says we need, and California does have nuclear and is trying to keep their nuclear going, it was only 4.6%. So then there was some geothermal, 3%, and solar was 0.8%, even though the sun had mostly gone down. So, yeah. That's where we're at. And again, we're just getting, this is the tip of the tip of the tip of the iceberg. This is nothing.
Yeah. And one of the arguments you hear is that, it's going to take up too much room, like all these solar panels and batteries and wind turbines. We don't have enough space for all this. But, looking at these numbers, California, they're not all the way there, but they're basically done it. And it's not like, they're having to tear down houses to put up solar farms. Like, this is all absolutely, totally doable.
Yeah. And, remember, we had a letter from a teenager in Alberta last week that said, space was going to be a problem. They were discussing it with their cab driver. I said, the studies show 0.5% of agricultural land in Alberta to get to 100% renewables. All these figures of what it takes for solar and wind, it's actually half of what golf courses take up in most countries.
Yeah, but we got to have our golf. You're not taking our golf courses away, are you?
How many people, what percentage of the population benefit from golf courses?
I used to golf, but it's been about 20 years.
Well, I've golfed in my life, but I'm not that the rich guy who goes there all the time and has a membership. So yeah, I mean, nobody's saying, golf courses take up land, we better take those away. I mean, we can't have that. Because people
sounds
are
like you're saying that, so you better watch it.
Golf courses, they take up a lot of water and chemicals and things like that. Brian, I've got a hot take this week. So hot, you better sit down. Oh, you are sitting down. Good.
Yeah.
You may notice people who are watching, I have a horse behind me. It's Charlie. Yeah. The horse it's a horse that my kids rode when they were kids. They could sit on top of it. It's a wooden horse and stuff.
Yeah, this is an audio podcast, but we do have video clips and versions that we put on YouTube and TikTok, etc.
And some people at that meeting said, "I know you from TikTok," so that kind of tells you the reach of TikTok.
TikTok celebrity.
Well, I mean, it's just the short clips, so they spread further. Where an hour podcast is a big commitment, rather than like a 30-second clip or something like that. But my hot take involves that horse, Brian. That's Charlie the horse. We've been threatening to send him to a farm upstate for years now, but we just can't get rid of him. We don't know how to get rid of him. My daughter sort of cut him open and gave him haircuts and things, and well, he's ripped. I don't think she cut him out, but he's ripped, and he's not. I can't re-gift him to, a used toy store or something like that, and then he takes up a lot of space. But I'm using him as a prop today because I have a hot take. It occurred to me, everything's going electric now, right? I mean, 2- and 3-wheelers are going electric in some parts of the world where they're used very rapidly. China is rapidly going to electric vehicles because some people are buying their first car. They don't have expectations of what gas is. It's not a big deal for them. And then pollution, of course, air pollution is a problem. It's a immediate problem in many big cities in China. And I just had this perspective of looking back. What would it be like to look back? I know where we're going. If you listen to this podcast, you know the world is going to an electric future powered by clean electricity. And electric cars have been the norm for us for years now. In this podcast hosting realm, we've had them for a while. So electrons are powering everything. And I just thought that when we look back, what's gas going to be? Gas is going to be the transition fuel between horses and electrons. That's my hot take. Gas and diesel, fossil fuels are the actual transition fuels between horses and what we're going to use probably forever. Unless we can levitate and Star Trek ourselves from place to place, electrons are probably going to be what powers us. Where we get those electrons from, maybe there's going to be fusion in the future. Maybe that'll be cheaper or easier. I don't know, but that's what we're going to do. And it's a transition. We're going to look back and it's going to be, okay, there's 100 years. We went from horses to what we're going to be using forever. And of course, everybody thinks, all these lefties in that room, no electric cars that I could find. What's with people? I'm poor. I'm a podcast host. My salary would shock you. My family income would make people weep. But I found a way to get electric vehicles, and one of the reasons I did it was for economics. The poorer you are, the better idea it is. So I just think as a transition fuel, as we're going to look back at it that way, oil and gas can be the transition between horses and electrons.
Because it's not the norm, there's just kind of extra research and extra work you have to do. Right now, where we live, if you want to drive electric, and most people have busy lives, they have other things to worry about. So it's absolutely not in the forefront, but people will listen to the podcast and learn more. But yeah, that takes us nicely, I think, into my first story here, which is about Disneyland. And I don't think I would have mentioned this story if I hadn't actually been there. But this is a story from the LA Times and from Electrek about the Autopia ride in Tomorrowland at Disneyland in California. And I mention it mostly because I went there with my kids. It was about 10 years ago. And probably around, 2014. And we took a family trip to Disneyland. My kids were still kind of young. And we went into the park. And basically the first ride we came across was Autopia, which is a kid's ride in Tomorrowland where kids get to drive these little cars around a track. And there's a rail that they can't, skip off of, but you can kind of drive these cars around. And in 2014, I was absolutely shocked to find that these things still ran on gasoline.
10 years ago.
And it's now 2024. They still run on gasoline. But finally, some activists were starting to bug Disney about this. And so they've now made a commitment. It's, ridiculously slow still. They say 30 months from now, this ride will be electrified. But I got to tell you, I would kind of think if I hadn't been there, this would be kind of a small story. Like, well, why are activists worried about Autopia at Disneyland?
Let me guess, you gagged on the fumes. Did you gag on the fumes?
It was disgusting. And we had to wait in line for, half hour, 45 minutes or something. You have to breathe the fumes the whole time you're waiting in line. These are basically lawnmower engines. So these are the stinkiest kind of gas engines. I'm reading the story here. It sounds like, so originally Chevron was the sponsor of this ride. They sometimes have corporate sponsors to these rides. So, they don't obviously particularly care about, pollution and electrification. But 2016, Honda took over as the sponsor of this ride. But as we know, Honda's been a bit of a laggard in switching to EVs. So, they didn't electrify it. They just went with more efficient gas engines. So they're apparently not quite as bad. So I got the really bad ones from probably around 2014. They upgraded in 2016 to slightly better electric motors. But it's just shocking to me. It's going to be more than 2 years before they switch these rides. It was so filthy. I could not believe it. And of course, it's in Tomorrowland. So it's supposed to be the land of the future. But of course, they established it in the 1950s. So what it's become now is a bit of a time capsule of what the vision of the future, looked like in 1950s. Which in itself is quite cool. I love that 1950s, futuristic aesthetic. That part is cool. But my God, Disney, come on. This is ridiculous. Another 2 more years to switch. Like, we've had electric bumper cars for decades. Bumper cars have always been electric.
Yes.
So it's not like
even when I was
some way to do
knee-high to whatever, I drove one of those cars. You would smell the sparks as the poles going up to the electrified roof would sort of slide along. Yeah, but they didn't have batteries. My first electric car, I've said this before in the show, was when I was 5. My dad at the time had sort of downgraded his career from a department store manager to a department store worker at a different department store, McLeod's it was called, and he would come home with broken returned merchandise that he got for cheap. So I didn't have a lot of stuff as a kid, especially outside of Christmas, but he came home with an electric battery electric car. I remember the battery, and I drove it around. It had headlights, and we had an unfinished basement. I would drive it around in circles while my mom did laundry, and then I got too heavy for it. Yeah, and then I went to go slow. The battery didn't last long, and it got slow, and so we gave it to one of my skinnier friends.
I've got one last fun thing from the story here. In the 7 decades since it went in, things have changed somewhat, to the point where the original designer of the Autopia cars, Bob Gurr, who is now 92 years old, he was interviewed by the LA Times and said, "Get rid of those god-awful gasoline fumes."
Yeah. Well, you tell him. That it does seem. It's really, wasn't it Tomorrowland? I mean, I don't know what the whole concept of Tomorrowland is. I'm not a Disney person. Is that like the future? Or why are they gas cars?
It was built in the 50s.
It should be the past. It should be the past.
Oh, absolutely.
Should be yesterday land.
California, as we were talking about in terms of the grid, California is also on the forefront of electric vehicles, and this is Disneyland in California.
All right. Well, Brian, I went to the book launch of Unjust Transition, The Future for Fossil Fuel Workers, the book that examines a lockout of an oil refinery that is in our city limits. And that's a problem because, Brian, I woke up this morning, I looked at what the wind direction was forecast to be overnight. It was west-northwest. I left my window open. I had a little fan in the window pumping in fresh air because it was warm. I'd like to keep it around, 67 degrees, whatever, 17 degrees, 18 degrees, cool. You sleep better when you're cool. Well, the wind let me down, Brian, because it stopped blowing, and then the refinery was blowing in my window. So I woke up breathing toxic air, and that is my worst nightmare. It becomes more worse since I've read chapter 5 of that book. I've described it as the best horror story I've ever written, scariest horror story I've ever read, rather. That was written by Patricia Elliott. Different people have contributed to this book, different academics. And I'm quoted in the book, so that's why I went to the book launch and gave a little spiel about living near the refinery, and that's what happened. The wind stopped blowing, and the refinery just spread out in all directions, including mine. And we've talked before about how cancer rates are higher within 10 miles of a refinery, which is 16 kilometers, which encompasses our entire 250,000 population in our area here, including the bedroom communities. And so, the fossil fuel workers got up and spoke. 3 of them, I think, got up and spoke about their union troubles. And by the way, it's not a corporation who runs the refinery. It's a co-op. It was originally assembled by farmers, but they're running it like a corporation, and they're just, I mean, the stories these people told about dead animals on their front step during the lockout and lies and the police siding with the corporations. And this is an issue that's covered in the book. The politicians, the police side with the money because, you know, that's what, and it's like the workers are the bad guys, and they're clearly not. And I told a story when I spoke about how, and I've mentioned this before in the podcast, if you're a longtime listener, I don't know if you'll remember it, but when I was 20 in 1986, I tried to organize a union. I actually had a lot in common with these guys because I was working for Shell Oil, essentially their food store, the second busiest food store in Western Canada, a confectionery and gas station. I fought the oil company because, you know, someone else came to me with a card and said, hey, do you want to form a union? This is one of the employees. And of course, they're all just teenagers, idiots. And some of them, that's going to be their career. I was going to university hoping to do bigger things. And I became the organizer. You know, I said, yes, hell yeah, let's do this. And we came within one vote of organizing this. I'm sure they would have shut it down or something, but it would have, you know, spread to other Shell food stores. It was a big deal. I testified in court as a 20-year-old, and I did a pretty good job, they said. They were quite happy with how I testified. I was very articulate, they said. And I was meeting with union people in the middle of the night, and, you know, I eventually became an employee of the union when they fired me from the Shell food store. Got a big payment of money from employment insurance when that happened because, if you can prove that you worked for a union, it worked out very well for people back then. So I was quite happy. So I had that in common with them, and I felt a very strong bond with these oil workers in the union sense that awoke in me that I hadn't felt in a long time. So yeah, they are my brothers, Brian. And this is I think this is Sean Tucker. This is one of the editors of the book. He's one of the academics who worked on it mostly from the University of Regina here in Regina, Saskatchewan, Canada. And he was on the radio describing the book and why they did. I'm just going to play a short clip of that.
We also examined the reason that Federated Co-op locked out its workers. They said that there's changing fuel demands coming up brought on by changing federal regulations related to CO2 emissions. And they said they needed concessions from their unionized workforces to fund major investments to transition the plant. That rationale was really never examined during the dispute, so we wanted to have a closer look at that. And then lastly, we also hope that the book will change how we talk about climate change and how we talk about the impact on workers. You know, human-induced climate change is real. We've had the warmest winter on record, although you wouldn't know it by this morning, the weather this morning, and record forest fires last year. And yet in Saskatchewan today, we still have a different narrative. And, you know, at recent SARM convention, there was a motion calling for the end of the vilification of CO2, and it passed with 95% support. So we have some work to do on changing how we talk about climate change in Saskatchewan.
Definitely an issue, and you know, the way he ended up talking about how, you know, the rural governments all got together and said we want to stop vilifying CO2. 95% of it passed. Yeah. I can't wrap my head around that. That is such a level of ignorance that I can't grasp right now. I'm sorry. But journalists didn't examine the issues when it happened, these labor issues, because we don't have anybody on a labor beat, and they often just, you know, they took the press releases from the corporation, this so-called co-op, and, you know, just sort of regurgitated them and didn't often do that. There's a lot of co-op board hijinks. I remember I worked for a cable company that has... that's a co-op, but I felt like it was being run like a company. Like I wasn't allowed to get a subscription because I was running an entertainment show. I wasn't allowed to get a subscription to the student newspaper because they were too left. So I was told that. And, you know, I said, this is a co-op. What the hell? You know, co-ops were kind of like the anti-right because they were farmers getting together and cooperating and doing things. And now there's this network of co-ops all across Western Canada. They all have different things, but they're under one big umbrella. And I'm not going to them anymore. These workers here, some of them live among me in the neighborhood here. They're not going to there either. They're boycotting them. Now, if you buy gas, well, then you got to go to Shell or the other companies, the other oil companies.
Yeah.
It's kind of a crappy way to look at it, right?
Not a lot of great choices. Of course, our electrical utility is not a great choice either because of the way that's being run. But, we are where we are.
I actually talked to your city councillor who was there for your region. And she was one of several people who told me to run for city council because we've got a bit of a Marjorie Taylor Greene in my district, a bit of a crazy person, a bit of a kook. The refineries, Brian, they want these good paying jobs, not only for themselves, but I heard the expression for the next 100 years. If they knew what I knew, if they listened to our show, if they understood the kind of trajectories we talk about, not only what's possible, but the trajectory of things, the prices of things, the adoption of different clean technologies around the world. It's not what happens here, although they could theoretically, because a lot of their products are sold locally, if everyone here stayed with gas cars, you could probably do that, but the world oil prices are going to be affected by the transition, regardless of what happens in Hicksville here. But yeah, they talk about that, like the Catholic Church does in terms of centuries, it's like, they want it for their kids and grandchildren. It was like a movie. And there was, people were yelling, shame, shame, these things that you would hear at a union rally or something like that. And it was just because they were dredging up these things from 4 years ago, and they're still very painful. A lot of these people will not forget, have not forget. There were slashed tires. There was people looking in their windows. And of course, the public was not on their side. They were on the side of the refinery, essentially of corporation, of big interest, of big money. They believed the crap. And so if people's spouses were on social media saying, the oil company's bad and the worker's good, people attack them. And, it was just... And one of the guys who talked to me, he lives near me, he looks like Lenny from The Simpsons. Which is funny because Lenny is essentially a blue-collar character who works in, nuclear energy, but he works in energy. But, it was kind of funny that this was a real life. He was a nice guy. He said that, one time the refinery emitted something and wrecked a shed, the paint on a shed. And I said, well, was that the same time that, all these car claims that my podcast host was talking about? He wasn't sure, but it was a long time ago. I also learned something. I didn't know this, but I live adjacent to a pipeline. Okay, so there's multiple pipelines in that easement. So it's something that my kids grew up on. We learned softball, we flew kites, we mowed it and put up a badminton court many years in a row. That wasn't there when this house was built in 1979. They actually built it later. Well, why would you build it through a subdivision? He said, because it was the straightest line between 2 points. And I said, well, you're not Bugs Bunny, go around the city. Why would you go right through a city and put us under risk like that? Because a pipeline is a risk. That's why there's a plane that flies at low altitude frequently to make sure it's not leaking. There's a reason for that.
The pipeline took a wrong turn at Albuquerque, I guess.
I love that line. I still use that. Yeah, they kept talking about the transition and they wanted protection from it. I guess, and this is rightfully so, they're not going to transition to $130,000 in the clean energy sector unless you're an engineer or you're one of the top people. I think workers are not going. There's so much money in oil that these jobs came about because it was such a lucrative business. They may not have been quite as good if there wasn't so much money. There's not as much. It's more democratized in clean energy because everybody, I've got energy generation on my roof. You do, it's spread out a bit more. And I don't see that high paying jobs coming and that permanent because, you put up a wind turbine here, you might go to the next province and put them up. The refinery doesn't move, obviously. The refinery's there, and it's polluting our city. All these guys live in the city. I came up with a line. I went there. I was going to badmouth fossil fuels, and I ended up doing a comedy routine instead. They went over fairly well. But I came up with this line. I said, I'm done with fossil fuels. I only breathe them now. I don't burn them. I only breathe them. And that got a laugh from the refinery guys.
Oh, and one thing I forgot on the Disneyland story, if you're a worker at Disneyland and you work at the Autopia ride, you get hazard pay.
Wow. That's a
because
big
of the
tag
fumes.
to that story. Holy crap. It's stupid. I mean, don't get me started. It's completely unnecessary. And yeah, future my ass. It's in the future, maybe they'll have one of those rides where, remember fossil fuels? This is what it was like. Let's drive around a little car. And, growing ups, grandpa will take the kids, and that'll be, I'll be the grandpa. Yeah. So my pipeline, like I said, it was only built there, and it shouldn't have been built there. So that's another hazard that I've not only. By the way, I'm 1.6 kilometers, or less than a mile away from the refinery, and the way it's described to me by the journalists, it goes up in the air through the smokestacks and then comes back down, not right near the refinery. There's no. They have air sensors on the fence line of the refinery, but they're not really affected by what comes out of the refinery. They also told me, this one worker told me, they dump worse stuff at night because nobody's looking. And, that's what I was breathing this morning. Thank you. And fortunately, it was just in the 7, 8 o'clock hour, but, or 6 and 7 o'clock hour, not all night. But he said the steel plant used to do that too before they got the scrubbers. They got some sort of scrubbers for their pollution. But yeah, this is what industry does. They, in the name of money, screw the general population over and affect their livelihoods, their lives, the length of their lives, their health. The book says refineries, operators might make $130,000. They're worried about having to shift to less, to like 70, and they quoted 70. I don't want to make 70. I've got this life. It's. I don't know what it's like, Brian, because I'm a Gen Xer. You made a film about how I don't have jobs. I mean, I was in that film because I didn't have jobs. Yeah. Well, these guys, they came out of high school. They might have had some training, and their life is set for them. They've got this career where it pays them well, and it's going to pay them well when they're done. They can retire after 25 years and have a good pension to live out their lives. And I'm assuming they've got cottages and things, and they're living the good life, the good middle-class life. And these are the type of jobs we talk about when we talk about auto workers and things like that. They contribute a lot because they're steady, because they're there, and they're going to be replaced. If one person leaves, another person takes over, and those jobs are there. They talked a lot about, CCS, like carbon capture and storage. They talked about farmers. And, speaking of CCS, I was talking about how our left of center party is not really, well, they're pissing me off because they're supporting fossil fuels. Well, one of their main people, who's the critic for SaskPower and Sask Energy, among other our critic for the utilities, the opposition critic, she used to work for the Petroleum Technology Resource Center during the construction of the Boundary Dam CCS facility. That's carbon capture and storage. This is a coal plant that is one of the first in the world. And, people have been looking at it for 15 years now, and it hasn't been producing. It hasn't cut the emissions that it said it would. I think it's like half or something. It's not great.
They have captured some of the carbon emissions, but obviously not all of them, and it just allows them to keep burning coal.
Well, she was part of that, and maybe that's why she's got her hand in the sand, and the party has the hand in the sand, and I'm not supporting them. And another thing is, there were 2 farmers named Kerr who lived near Weyburn, Saskatchewan, who were right on the property of where that carbon was stored. And the year after that started, they started to see carbon dioxide in their land bubble up. And this was a news story, a national news story. And they hired people who said, yeah, that's coming from, we can trace the oil that it's pushing into the ground and pumping the oil out. And the carbon is supposed to stay in the ground. And a number of studies were done afterwards that discredited that. But these people, this couple who now live in our city because they're retired, they were damn sure that, because they lived for generations, they lived on that land, and then suddenly carbon dioxide is coming out a year after they start pumping it into the ground. Come on. And, it was all these weird, and there was dead animals because they were going near the swamps and the ponds, and they were just dying. And this was something that hadn't happened before. But what changed? They started pumping carbon dioxide, and if it comes under the ground, well, it's useless, right? Because it's back in the atmosphere again and causing global warming.
Yeah, it's not actually capturing it if it just escapes.
So later on in the podcast, I'll come back in a few minutes and talk about what the oil refinery workers are saying about the transition.
So this next story is related to electric vehicles, but it's really about tires. Do you remember hearing about airless tires?
Yes, it comes up from time to time.
Every decade, there's a major story about how car tires are going to go airless. They've got these designs where you shouldn't have to have air in your tires. The problem being is that, you run over a nail or something and your tire is flat. But this could be an important part of the electric car future because it affects particularly things like, cabs, taxis, and eventually autonomous taxis, which are going to have to drive, 24 hours a day. Autonomous taxis of the near future are going to all be electric. And you don't want to be able to disable the whole robo-taxi fleet by just throwing a bunch of nails on the road. Like this could really, a lot of people, we've had stories about people attacking the autonomous taxis in San Francisco. People like to throw things at them and so forth. But anyway, it's the future of airless tires. It's still not here, but this is from Green Car Reports. We are at least perhaps getting closer. Michelin is now doing a pilot project of these airless tires, and they're doing it with the French Postal Service and DHL Express in Singapore. So only about 50 vehicles, but they're going to run about 50 vehicles with these airless tires just to see if they work. It says that they are heavier than regular tires, so this is one of the downsides. But of course, you would save weight in a vehicle because you don't need a spare tire. You don't need a jack. You don't need these other things. So
I'm looking at a picture of one from the side here that you've got on the story, and you can see right through it. It's sort of like, I don't know, this sort of hard mesh that's flexible, but also...
Yeah. Instead of having air, you have some type of a flexible mesh. So the whole tire is all rubber. And I've seen various designs. They're sort of like honeycomb designs. So, it needs to have some give to it. And of course, people aren't going to like them if the performance isn't as good, if they don't feel as good, if they don't drive as good. So all that stuff needs to be sort of proven out. But it's really, I think it's the robo-taxi future that's going to actually push this technology forward, because anybody doing a fleet of autonomous taxis is not going to want to stop and, fix flat tires. These cars are going to have to run, 20 hours a day, 24 hours a day. So, I don't know. Hopefully we're getting close. It's a 2-year pilot project. They have apparently been talking to Cruise. They've been talking to Tesla, the various companies working on, autonomous taxis. And, hopefully we can, eventually have a story about this where it's actually happening.
Yeah. And if you're new to the show, when we say robotaxi future, we're talking about autonomous vehicles and subscribing to that service, because it'll be transportation as a service. It'll be cheaper than car ownership once automation takes over, and we see that happening definitely by next decade. I don't see it taking any longer. It's already under... most people I talk to, they say it's never going to happen. I say, well, it's happening now. They're actually doing it. They've been doing it for years in multiple U.S. cities as a test. I mean, it can be frustrating at times because they're overly cautious. They won't drive like most people drive. They'll drive cautiously, and people get a little frustrated behind them, or maybe the computers crash, or they get confused and they clog, a little offshoot of one of the main streets or something, and they have to turn around, and it's frustrating to people. And there was one incident where a gas car hit a person and they went under the robotaxi, and the robotaxi did not do what it should have done, and the person was hurt. So here's what oil refineries are saying about the transition. It's mentioned in the book quite a bit. They've did a chapter about where they're talking to them about it. It kind of,
Yeah.
from my perspective, Brian, when I kind of have a really good, feel like I've got a better view of the future on this area than anybody in town. Like people just, I know I consume a lot of information. You do too for this podcast before we come here. Most people don't have the time or energy, as you've said, to do stuff like that. And that's understandable. But I know a lot. I know what's going on. I know what the future is going to look like. And
so you get out of the house one time and you think you know everything.
Well, I do know everything. And I should get out more so I can spread that knowledge more, not only through the podcast, but through interactions with other human beings, as long as they're not diseased.
Yeah. So this is what the oil refinery workers have been saying.
Yeah. And at the place, at the book launch, 3 times they mentioned the convoys people, because I feel like the people from the convoy have a lot of the attention of people around here, which is a rural place kind of mostly. And,
Yeah, and here in Canada, we had a convoy of protesters that went to Ottawa. It was a long, annoying story.
It was about COVID, but this is the same thing. They're angry at everything and a lot of things, and it's not just that; it's also the changing world, and they've taken the side of fossil fuels. So they mentioned them a lot for some reason, but they also said, the people that are supporting those convoys are not supporting the workers; they're supporting the companies, because the workers are really what they should be supporting. The workers talked about the need for education and retraining. If they don't really know what the transition looks like. They assume people aren't going to go buy Teslas and things like that. They just assume that. They don't really know what it looks like. I think they've pushed it away. They don't want to know, but part of that cognitive dissonance again, but they recognize that new jobs are unlikely to match their existing pay and benefits, which is true. That's why oil jobs are so good, but you can't say, they can't go away, because we have to save the planet for our children to have a livable planet. And it's already in pretty bad shape now. So one guy says in the book, and I'm going to quote from the book because they interviewed them. He says, I think it's inevitable. I worry about maybe what replaces it, not fuel cells, but like batteries. Okay, are we trading CO2 off for battery waste or nuclear waste, just trading one problem for another? But obviously there'll be a point where fossil fuels, probably no longer sustainable. And another guy says, nope, bought fuel. I'm always going to buy fuel. No point in buying one of those new Teslas. I guess maybe that'll just be the convenience will win over the convenience of gas. There's I think a misconception even among probably the people in that room last night that electric cars are inconvenient. With actually, gas cars are inconvenient. EVs, by and large, your overall experience is very, very convenient. Even when you do go on a trip, you don't have to sit there and pump gas. You just plug it in and walk to your restaurant, have your pee break, and get a coffee or have lunch. And, you don't do anything. You don't have to do anything. You don't have to pay for it. It just bills you from plugging it in. Another person says, a lot of people at work are trying not to talk about climate change, but that demand change, like I said, the people demanding change, we always seen this demand curve disappearing one way or another. They've always, it's always, if you started 30 years ago, that they talked about oil not lasting forever, the running out of oil, and that we're going to have to transition. Well, we found more oil, always find more oil, and now we got to get rid of that oil, using that oil. Another person says, I sincerely hope the refinery is still there. It's value added for the facility, for the number. It pumps a tremendous amount of money into the community and economy as a whole, not only individuals employed there, but through jobs in the community as well. True, but at what cost? One person dies of cancer from your fumes. Is that worth it? To me, it's not. And it's hard to quantify that, because you can't say, Joe here, he died of cancer. He could have lived 20 more years because he got it from the refinery. You can't trace it to what you got it from necessarily. If you're a refinery worker, there's actually a lot of asbestos at the refinery too. People are, those guys, some of them, they know they're not going to live forever. But they don't want to, he says, these guys don't want to hear it. This is the refinery worker. They just want to continue doing what we've always done, just keep it going. So yeah, they're plugging their ears and continuing on. Another person says, because we could totally rely on solar and wind here, but it's just people wouldn't have to be used to not using as much energy, right? Or we'd have to not take that car trip or not do things. So he thinks there's a sacrifice with renewables. There's not. In fact, it's the opposite, because we're going to have a lot of time, most of the time when we're 100% clean, there's going to be a surplus of power, because you have to build it up for the worst times. So that means that 98% of the time you're going to have free or cheap, lower cost electricity that you can do things with, such as run a shop with the air conditioner on and keep the front door open if you want to. We've talked about that on the show. This is some of the support they would like to see. And one person says, I guess for a wind down, I would hope that the employer would at least be environmentally able to remediate or clean up whatever site they are leaving. Not true, Brian. I don't see that happening. This is going to be a big issue for the transition for people who do have oil, like our province of Saskatchewan and Alberta, because the companies are going to go bankrupt. They're going to just shut down operations. They're not going to want to spend all the billions of dollars necessary to clean up their operations. It's going to be on the taxpayer. And this is what knowledge I feel like I have that our governments and opposition parties don't seem to think about, because it's not just the fact that those oil jobs and the contribution to the economy is going to go away. It's the bill to clean up their mess that's going to be on us, and that's going to make it hard to be a resident of this area or any petrol area in Western world. Another person says, I know things like abandoned wells and things like that exist. I have no doubt at the end of the accountants and the lawyers for the co-op refinery and things would wind down, and they're going to be like, no, there's no more money. Workers' names were kept anonymous, and the researchers had to go through a review board at their university before they could even talk to them. That's how scared they are of fossil fuels and how powerful fossil fuels are in this place. So, yeah. That's that, Brian. I'm going to just leave it there.
Okay. All right. So, under the realm of what is possible, the electric future is possible. New York City's first electric skyscraper. It's been open for a while now. This is an apartment tower in downtown Brooklyn that is completely electric. I think it's been open for about a year now. This is a 44-story tower, 505 State Street in Brooklyn, and it is the first all-electric skyscraper in New York. And this building is super cool. It's a triangle-shaped building, which you don't normally see in a newer, like a Flatiron building,
right,
but it's all sort of a glass tower skyscraper. And they went all electric. So this is due in part to the rules that New York City and New York State have put forward for things like electrification. And there's already rules in place to make sure that there's no fossil fuels in shorter buildings up to 7 stories high. But for towers, the rules don't come in effect till the middle of 2027. So they could have heated this building with gas. And in fact, they were planning to do that when they were first working on this. But they ran into a couple of roadblocks. National Grid, and this story is from Bloomberg, by the way, National Grid halted new gas connections in Brooklyn. It was part of a standoff between the utility and state regulators over a $1 billion gas pipeline that the utility wanted greenlit, but the regulators had blocked a key permit, citing water quality issues. And around the same time, New York City Council passed Local Law 97, requiring a 40% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions from certain buildings by 2030 relative to 2005. Though the law lacked clear guidance, the double whammy of gas connection woes and pending regulation led Pyers and his colleagues to bet the city would, over time, incentivize electrification or penalize anything that was using carbon-based fossil fuel. And so they decided to go electric before they needed to. So this is really just electric heating and cooling, and then induction cooktops. They were planning to do gas cooktops, but, they ended up going with induction, which is frankly better. And of course, there's indoor air quality problems if you're burning gas anyway. But in New York City, because most people take the public transit, buildings are actually the largest source of greenhouse gas emissions. In a lot of places, it's transportation. That's usually the thing. But because it's so densely packed, people take the public transit. It's actually gas and oil burning furnaces and water heaters that are responsible for 40% of New York City's emissions. So New York City has been at the forefront of these kind of rules, stopping new gas hookups in buildings because they know that this is the key, in an electric future where we don't have any of these things. So if you want to rent a studio apartment in this building, only $3,475 a month for a studio, $11,000 to rent a three. There are apparently some affordable housing units in there as well. There's a school in the main floor as well. There's a nice diagram here on Bloomberg of how the whole thing works. It's, basically hot water and cold water running in pipes up and down the building that can heat and cool everything. It's actually, the water is heated with basic resistive electric water boilers, because when they started putting this project together, there wasn't necessarily the heat pump boilers that they needed. So the company that built this, they have other projects planned. So in the future, they're going to go with a heat pump type boiler. But for this building, it's just basic old fashioned resistive heating to heat the water. It's not the most efficient, but hey, you can, heat and cool a massive skyscraper in New York City completely electrically, and everybody's cleaner and happier. They talk about, going to visit the boiler room, in the basement of the building, and it's all pleasant and nice. Think of what is the boiler room like at the Empire State Building? I can't imagine going down to
yeah, it'd probably be pretty stinky.
Kind of filthy disgust. I mean, there's probably a coal chute, right? Like when the Empire State Building was built, there was probably a coal chute in the side of the building to put in coal to heat it.
Yeah. Well, that's an interesting story. It's a very high Flatiron building, so it'll be very unique to New York City, I think.
Yeah, but definitely the norm in the future.
I just want to touch on the refinery story one more time. I'm going to say that Andrew Stevens, one of the editors of the book, has agreed to be on our podcast for an interview. So if you are a local person listening to our show, some people are, then that might be of interest to you. It's also interesting because I hope to talk about the dynamic between big oil and citizens and things like that, and how much power they have. So that could be interesting as well. It's time for the lightning round.
The lightning round is a fast-paced look at the latest headlines in climate, clean energy and transportation.
Solar on railway tracks. And I don't mean along the side of railway tracks. I mean between the rails, Brian. There's a Swiss startup, Sunways, is installing solar panels on railway tracks in Switzerland. The panels are reportedly being rolled out like a carpet on a train. They just roll it out, automatically put it between the tracks, and then trains will have a little brush on the back to clean the panels. Is this a good idea? It is not. I've determined that. Like I said, I'm a genius.
Because
I know everything.
An expert in rail-based solar.
And I left the house the other day, so. Well, the thing is, I think it would be better because it's pointed straight up, and, it's getting rattled around, so there could be maintenance issues if it goes down. And how do you repair a solar panel when there's a train coming at you? Yeah, also, I looked at the amount of room on the tracks. It's not as much as you might think in Europe, although they're hoping to expand to Europe. I think it's better. There's been ideas about putting vertical or, angled solar panels because there's a lot of room on tracks. They buy the land, be left and right of the tracks, and there's a lot of room there for them to do that. So this seems odd to me. It seems one of those trying too hard to solve a problem that doesn't exist things.
Well, a big thing we've been talking about on the show lately is that because the price of solar panels are dropping, there's just basically new uses and places people are putting them. People are putting them up as a fence, solar panels as a fence, because, building a fence out of wood or something else is super expensive as well. So, why not make it solar panels and get some energy? We'll see how that goes between the railway tracks.
Brian, parts of India are being seared under a heat wave with the maximum temperatures ranging between 40 and 46 Celsius. You factor in humidity, and that is deadly heat. And among the intense heat, Brian, I thought I mentioned this story. A TV anchor who was talking about the heat wave fainted on the air from heat.
Wow.
And had to be revived. It was time for a CS Fast Fact. There are now almost 8,200 fast-charging EV stations across the United States, or one for every 15 gas stations. So that's not bad when you consider that, 1 in 15 cars is not electric yet on the highways in the States, but.
Yeah, and
but
we're actually not going to need.
Yeah, you got to fill in those deserts. That's the problem. You got to fill in those spots with, and that's happening.
But because you charge your electric car at home 90% of the time, assuming you have a driveway or a parking spot, we're not going to actually need as many electric charging stations as we have gas stations because, you fuel up at home most of the time.
It's time for a bonus fast fact. Between 2001 and 2018, the number of car trips taken in Paris fell by 60%. Over that same period, public transit trips increased by 40% and bicycle trips by 20%. They are trying to make it a bikeable, walkable city and get rid of, that sort of combustion lifestyle. Honda, I don't think this is out yet. Honda has agreed to build some sort of assembly plant for EVs and battery manufacturing in Ontario. The details are not announced yet, but it's been leaked out. The Premier of Ontario, the province in Canada, says that it is the biggest such project in Canadian history. So we'll talk about that next week. If it's been announced officially, when Bloomberg broke the story. History has been made over the period of April 1 to 14, the first half of April in China, Brian. Sales of new energy vehicles, that's sales of mostly vehicles with a plug and a few hydrogen vehicles, reached 50% of the market share. So 50% of the vehicles sold in China in the first half of April were at a staggering 50.39%. The best predictions were at 40% this year, and some people said 25% was kind of where the market was going. Well, suddenly it's taken off, and of course, combustion vehicle sales year on year are going down because of economic issues, but the electric vehicles are taking off because you can buy a $5,000 electric vehicle in China, a small one, and do really well locally with that vehicle.
And Norway, as we know, leading the way. Well over 90% of new cars are electric in Norway. But for China to be up to 50%, considering how much bigger, Norway is only a few million people. But of course, China is massive. And 50% for electric car sales is a big deal.
We've talked about solar on water before. This is kind of a thing where I don't know if it's necessary or not, but sometimes it helps water because it prevents evaporation. So they put solar panels on water, basically floating them on structures in the water. Usually they're flat or close to flat. Well, now there's a company in Germany that wants to make them vertical, because there's regulations in Germany that says only a maximum of 15% of a water surface can be covered with solar modules. So that means in order to get more juice out of whatever body of water you want to put solar on, they've got to adapt. So they've made them sort of vertical, and it becomes uneconomical. But apparently this startup has found a viable solution. It plans to build what it describes as the world's first floating PV system. That's photovoltaics, in other words, solar power modules, and install them vertically. I don't know. The UK is shutting down its last coal plant. Brian, 141 years ago was when they installed their first coal plant. So you can see how that was a transition fuel. It's just temporary.
Yeah, just a temporary transition
Very helpful
fuel.
for a while. We don't need it anymore. Indonesian clerics have issued fatwas that frame environmental protection as a religious obligation, aiming to curb climate change and preserve the nation's biodiversity. That's from EHN. Interesting. We hear the Pope sometimes going on about it. We've had him on the show about the moral obligation to a clean planet. Well, it is reaching other religions as well. balcony update. We've talked about solar on balconies in Europe. In China, it's a big thing. 400,000 plug-in solar systems have been installed in Germany, mostly on people's, on most of these systems, these little systems, these small systems that you can buy at the store on people's balconies. That's apartments, condos, things like that. Well, new data shows that at least 50,000 of these PV devices were added in the first quarter of 2024. So there's 400,000 there now, and they've already added another 50. It's going to be like every balcony that doesn't face north is going to have solar panels in Europe one of these days soon.
It's a staggering number, but I think it shows you that people want to do something. And of course, people who live in apartments can't normally put up solar, but somebody invents something that can go on a balcony, and 400,000 people in Germany have gone with it.
And finally this week, something a little different. A letter at the end of the show, Brian. Totally different. I like to mix things up from time to time. This is from Austria. I'm going to get you to read part of this letter in a second. It says, "Hi, Brian and James. I'm 25 years old and found your show when I was in desperate need for good news regarding the fight against climate change. Well, you come to the right place. This is it. You found it. Today, I wanted to give back and share some hopeful clean energy facts about my tiny home country of Austria, which you probably didn't know. Austria, Brian, is about 6 million people, the size of about Toronto. Famous country, well-known, very old, only 6 million people. So would you read the next part?
Letter continues. We have a clean electricity grid at about 80% renewables, which puts us at the top in Europe. We no longer have any coal power plants, and we've never had any nuclear power plants. The high share of renewables is mostly due to hydro, but wind and especially solar are catching up quickly. Currently, solar produces about 7 terawatt hours, but the goal is to increase that number to 41 terawatt hours by 2030. But we desperately need batteries because there are now situations where we produce like 10 gigawatt hours more electricity compared to what even our much bigger neighbor country of Germany consumes. Austria was also quite early to break the important 5% barrier of EV sales. Of course, there are big challenges in the adoption of clean energy solutions. Mostly, it's about stubbornness by people who don't know better or are captured by big oil arguments."
He goes on to say he's a follower of Tony Seba, which is the person who studies disruption technologies through economics and technology converging. And Tony Seba has said many times and predicted what we're at now, the falling declines in cost curves and such for renewables. And
the world can run on solar, wind, and batteries.
He says, "I'm convinced that when we look back on the times of global clean energy and mobility adoption, we will laugh about the fact how blatantly we underestimated its growth." Cheers, Hans in Austria. Thank you for that letter, and cheers to Austria for doing such a great job, Brian.
Yeah, and that's our show for this week. If you want to contact us, cleanenergyshow@gmail.com. Around social media, we're Clean Energy Pod. And you can leave us a voicemail, speakpipe.com/cleanenergyshow.
We went long this week. This is our historically longest episode in history. We're usually around 15 minutes, and we'll keep it about 15 minutes in the future. Hey, you can find videos of our show on TikTok, as some of the people I ran into the other night did. And we're on YouTube as well, including special content that you may not have just on the podcast. We make special video content sometimes. The Clean Energy Show store is linked in your show notes. If you'd like to check out our merchandise, a t-shirt or a hat, rate and review us. That helps us a lot when you do that on Apple or wherever you're listening to our show. If you give us a rating and review, that helps. So help spread the podcast to other people so they can be happy. Donate with PayPal to help us keep podcasting. The link is also in your show notes. If you're new to the show, welcome. But remember, you got to subscribe. So every week we make a show, and it comes to your podcast app when you subscribe for free. And we'll see you again next week.
See you next week.
The Clean Energy Show.